The dress was the color of old snow. Ivy had spent 3 weeks sewing every detail with her own hands, by candlelight, after the castle's chores were done. It was not a noblewoman's gown. It had no gold embroidery, no imported lace from the southern territories. It was fine linen, carefully washed until it was almost white, with a braided leather sash at the waist, and small wildflowers embroidered along the hem. Flowers she had drawn herself, stitch by stitch, on the nights when the cold pressed against the stone windows, and the wind howled outside as though the world itself was restless. It was the banquet of return. Once a year, when the Alpha King came back from the borderlands after the watch season, the entire court gathered in the great hall of Castle Vorden to celebrate. Whole packs made the journey of days just to be present. Banners of every alliance hung from the stone rafters, deep crimson, forest green, ash gray, iron black. The long tables were loaded with roasted boar, dark bread, clay pitchers of spiced wine, bowls of smoked root vegetables, and candles burned low in iron chandeliers above it all. The hall smelled of pine resin, tallow, and the particular musk of assembled wolves, something dense and alive, like a forest before a storm. Ivy stood at the entrance to the hall and breathed it all in. She was 23 years old, and she had lived inside these castle walls since she was brought in as a ward of the Vorden pack at the age of 9. After her father's small border settlement was destroyed in a territorial dispute. She had no family name worth speaking, no bloodline that anyone at court would recognize. She was simply Ivy, the quiet one, the useful one, the woman who knew where every spare candle was stored and how to treat a wolf's fever with bark tea and patience. For 4 years, she had also been Draven's wife, not by choice of the court, not by celebration or announcement. It had happened quietly, during a winter council, when Draven had needed a woman of the castle to fulfill an old alliance requirement, a wife recorded in the pack's formal ledger. Ivy had been chosen because she was present, because she was obedient, and because no one of noble blood had been willing to accept the terms. It was not a union built on warmth. Draven had left for the borderlands within a fortnight of the arrangement, and in 4 years, he had returned only twice, briefly, coldly, and without looking at her for longer than necessary. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself many things. But tonight was different. Tonight, a messenger had come to her chamber 3 days before the banquet with a sealed letter bearing Draven's mark, a black wolf on a field of dark blue. Inside, in handwriting that was precise and severe, were 7 words. Wear something suitable. You will stand beside me. 7 words, after 4 years. Ivy had read them so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Her closest friend in the castle, a young woman named Petra who worked in the weaving rooms, and had known Ivy since their first winter together as wards, had found her sitting on the floor of her chamber, holding that letter like it was a fragile thing. "He wants you there," Petra had said, her dark eyes cautious. "That means something." "It means he needs a wife present for appearances," Ivy had replied. "Maybe," Petra had said. Then after a pause, "Or maybe it means something else." Ivy had chosen to believe, just for 3 weeks, that it meant something else. That was why she had made the dress. That was why she had braided her pale hair with a thin cord of silver that Petra had given her, and why she had pressed the wildflowers into the hem with such careful, hopeful hands. Now she stood at the entrance to the great hall and watched the court move around her like a river around a stone. She found him almost immediately. Draven stood at the far end of the hall near the Alpha's table, a long raised platform of dark oak where only the highest-ranking wolves were permitted to sit. He was exactly as she remembered, and somehow more. Broad through the shoulders, dressed in black leather and a fur-lined cloak the color of midnight, his dark hair pulled back in the way of warriors returning from long campaigns. There was a new scar along his jaw that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His pale blue eyes were scanning the room with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had been born knowing he was the most dangerous thing in any space he entered. Ivy started toward him. Slowly. With all the dignity she had practiced in the quiet of her chamber. She was perhaps 20 steps away when she saw the woman beside him. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in deep burgundy that caught the torchlight like a wound. She stood close to Draven, closer than protocol required, closer than any woman had a right to stand beside a man who had a wife recorded in the pack ledger. She was laughing at something he had said, and Draven who never smiled, Draven who communicated in 7-word sentences, was looking at her with an expression Ivy had never once seen directed at herself. Not warmth, exactly, but attention. Real attention. The kind that costs something. Ivy stopped walking. Around her, the court continued its noise and movement, unaware. Somewhere behind her, a trio of musicians had begun playing something low and ceremonial. The smell of roasting meat and spiced wine pressed against her from every direction. A wolf pup from one of the visiting packs ran past her feet, nearly knocking her sideways. She steadied herself against a stone pillar. Petra appeared at her elbow from nowhere, as she always did. "Ivy." "I see it," Ivy said quietly. "That's Seraphine. She came with his escort from the borderlands. They've been saying in the kitchens that she—" "I see it, Petra." She had made the dress herself. She had embroidered every wildflower by hand. She had read 7 words so many times the paper had gone soft. Draven finally looked up, and across the hall, his pale blue eyes found her. There was a moment, just a breath, where something moved behind his expression. Recognition. Perhaps something more complicated than that. Then Seraphine said something close to his ear, and he looked away. Ivy released the stone pillar. She straightened her spine. She lifted her chin to the angle that Petra always called her quiet war face. Not defiant, not broken, simply closed. She turned and began walking toward the side corridor that would take her out of the great hall, without passing through the center of the room. She would not make a scene. She would not give the court that satisfaction. She would walk out of this hall exactly the way she had walked in, upright, silent, and belonging to no one's pity. She had almost reached the corridor entrance when 3 men stepped into it from the other direction, blocking the path without meaning to, or perhaps meaning to entirely. She couldn't tell, because when she looked up, the words she had been rehearsing for her own composure dissolved completely. They were wolves. That much was obvious from the way they carried themselves. That particular stillness that high-ranking wolves had, like predators who had long since stopped needing to prove anything. All 3 were dressed in traveling clothes still dusty from the road, as though they had arrived tonight and come straight to the hall without stopping to change. Their cloaks bore no Vordan colors. The one on the left was broad and fair-haired, with a grin that suggested he found the entire world mildly amusing. The one in the center was leaner, dark-eyed, watching her with an expression of open and unguarded curiosity. And the one on the right was very still. He was the tallest of the 3, dark-haired like the center man, but with a quality of silence around him that felt different from simple quietness. It felt like the silence before something significant happened. His eyes were dark gray, almost the color of the stone walls around them, and they were fixed on her with an attention that was neither rude nor polite. It was simply complete. As though she were the only thing in the hall worth looking at, and he had already decided that some time ago. "You're leaving," the fair-haired one said. It wasn't a question. "I'm walking," Ivy replied evenly. "In the wrong direction," said the dark-eyed one in the center, with something that might have been amusement. "The main exit is the other way." "I'm aware of where the exits are," she said. "I've lived in this castle for 14 years. The still one on the right said nothing. He just watched her. And somehow his silence was louder than the other 2 combined. The fair-haired wolf tilted his head. You made that dress yourself. Ivy blinked. It was such a specific thing to say that it stopped her entirely. How could you possibly know that? He shrugged, still grinning. The stitching on the hem, it's uneven in the way that careful hands make when they're working by low light. Noble seamstresses don't work by low light. He paused. It's a good dress. Ivy looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the quiet one on the right, who was still watching her with those gray eyes, still saying nothing. Excuse me, she said, and stepped forward. None of them moved, but none of them stopped her either. They simply parted enough to let her through, and as she passed, she felt something she could not name. A shift in the air, a change in pressure, like walking past a fire that was larger than it looked. She stepped into the corridor and kept walking. Behind her, she heard the fair-haired one say something low. She didn't catch the words, but she heard the quiet one respond. Just 4 words, in a voice that was deep and unhurried and absolutely certain. Find out who she is. The corridor was cold. Ivy welcomed it. The stone walls of the eastern passage held none of the Great Hall's warmth, and the torches here were spaced farther apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between pools of amber light. She walked through them without slowing, her soft shoes nearly silent against the worn floor, the embroidered hem of her dress whispering against the stone. She did not cry. She had made a firm decision about that somewhere between the pillar and the corridor entrance, and she intended to keep it. There was a particular kind of pain that deserved tears, and a particular kind that deserved something quieter and more permanent. This was the second kind. This was the kind that settled into the bones and became simply knowledge. A thing you now knew that you hadn't known before, even if some part of you had suspected it for a long time. Draven had not come home to her. He had come home, but not to her. She turned into the narrow staircase that led to the upper residential wing, where her chamber was located. It was a small room by castle standards. Stone floor, a single window that faced the forest, a bed frame that creaked in the cold, and a writing desk where she kept her few important things in a locked wooden box. It was not a wife's chamber. A wife of the Alpha King should have occupied the southern suite, the warm rooms with the wide windows and the fireplace large enough to stand in. Those rooms had been empty for 4 years, locked from the outside, as though Draven had not yet decided what to do with the fact of her existence. She had her small room. She had learned to be grateful for it. She was 3 steps from the top of the staircase when Petra caught up with her, slightly breathless from running. Ivy, stop. I'm not running, Ivy said without stopping. I'm walking. There's a difference. You're walking very fast for someone who isn't running. Petra fell into step beside her, her dark braids swinging. Those 3 men, do you know who they are? No. The fair-haired one is Soren. The dark-eyed one in the center is Kale. They're brothers. Petra paused, clearly waiting for a reaction. When none came, she continued. And the quiet one, Ivy. The quiet one is Aldrich of Ravenspire. Ivy stopped walking. She turned to look at Petra. Aldrich, she repeated. Aldrich, Petra confirmed, with the gravity the name deserved. Ravenspire was not a pack. It was a sovereignty. A territory of 7 packs unified under a single ruling bloodline 3 generations ago, when the old borders had been redrawn after the last great territorial war. The Ravenspire Alpha ruled not just his own wolves, but the loyalty of 6 other pack leaders, and that loyalty was not given lightly. In the hierarchy of the wolf world, there were Alpha Kings, and then there was Aldrich of Ravenspire, who was, by most counts, something above that category entirely, not a king. Something older. Something the old texts called a High Lord of Wolves, a title so ancient that most of the court had forgotten it meant anything at all. He had been watching her with those gray eyes and asking his brothers to find out who she was. Ivy turned and continued walking. It doesn't matter. How does that not matter? Because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change what I saw in the hall. It doesn't change what Draven... She stopped herself, breathed. It doesn't change my situation. Petra was quiet for a moment as they reached the residential corridor. The torches here were steadier, the stone floor covered by a long runner of woven wool that muffled their steps. Ivy's chamber was at the end, the last door on the left. "What are you going to do?" Petra asked. Ivy reached her door. She put her hand on the iron latch and stood there for a moment, looking at the dark wood grain of it. The door was old. Everything in this castle was old. Older than Draven. Older than the alliance that had brought her here. Older than every promise that had ever been made in this building and quietly broken. "I'm going to think," she said finally. "I've been very patient for 4 years. I think it's time I thought clearly about what patience has actually given me." She went inside and closed the door. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her writing desk with the locked wooden box open before her and went through its contents slowly, the way a person does when they are taking inventory of what they actually possess versus what they only thought they had. There was a letter from her father, written the year before his settlement was destroyed. She had been too young then to read it herself, and someone had read it to her, and she had memorized it so thoroughly that the words were in her bones now, not just in her memory. There was a small iron ring that had been her mother's. There was the map she had drawn herself of the castle's eastern passages, made during her first winter when she had been afraid of getting lost. There was the 7-word letter from Draven, its folds gone soft. She looked at that one for a long time. Then she placed it at the bottom of the box, beneath everything else, and closed the lid. Morning came gray and cold, with frost on the inside of her window glass. Ivy dressed practically, a dark wool dress, her heavier cloak, her good boots, and went down to the castle kitchens to help with the morning work, as she always did. The banquet of return meant guests from a dozen packs were still sleeping in the guest quarters, which meant the kitchens needed to produce a substantial breakfast without warning and with limited supplies. Ivy knew the stores better than anyone. She knew which root cellar had the dried provisions, which smokehouse still had cured haunches from the autumn, and which of the kitchen staff could be trusted to work quietly before dawn without needing direction every 5 minutes. She worked. It was the thing she was best at, and it was the thing that had always made her feel least invisible, not because anyone praised her for it, but because the work itself was real. The bread rose, or it didn't. The fire caught, or it didn't. There was an honesty to it that the rest of castle life often lacked. She was carrying a heavy tray of clay cups toward the great breakfast table in the outer hall when she heard them. Voices from the study corridor, the narrow passage that ran alongside the Alpha's private meeting rooms. She recognized Draven's voice first, that particular flat authority of it. And then another voice, lower and unhurried, that she recognized despite having heard it only once, and only saying 4 words. Aldrich of Ravenspire. She slowed without meaning to. "The border agreements are straightforward," Draven was saying. "Ravenspire holds the northern passage. Forden maintains the eastern watch. Nothing has changed." Something has changed. Aldrich's voice was calm. "You've been absent from your own territory for an entire season. Your pack council has made 3 significant decisions without your presence. Your alliance obligations have been delayed twice." A pause. "These are not criticisms, Draven. They are observations. I had reasons for the extended stay at the border. I know what your reasons were." Another pause, and the quality of Aldrich's silence even in speech was something Ivy could feel through the stone wall. A weight. A pressure. Like deep water. "That is precisely why I made the journey from Ravenspire. This is an internal Vorden matter. When the stability of a pack that shares 3 border agreements with my sovereignty becomes uncertain, it ceases to be entirely internal." There was no sharpness in the way he said it, just the steady certainty of a man stating a fact that the floor and the walls and the air already knew. "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here because I was invited by your own council, whether you know it or not." A long silence. Then Draven. What do you want, Aldrich? Right now? Breakfast. The faintest trace of something dry in his voice. We can discuss the rest this afternoon. Footsteps. Ivy moved quickly, adjusting her grip on the tray and continuing down the corridor before either man emerged. She made it to the outer hall and set the tray down with steady hands, arranged the cups in the order she always arranged them, and stood back. Her heart was doing something complicated. She had not been imagining things. There was genuine instability in Vorthen. She had felt it for months in the way the council members spoke in low voices and went quiet when she entered rooms. Draven's prolonged absence at the Borderlands, his return with Seraphine, the delayed alliance meetings. The pack sensed something shifting. A territory without a clear, present leader developed fractures the way Old Stone did. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. She was still thinking about this when she turned and found Aldrich of Ravenspire standing in the doorway of the outer hall. He was dressed more formally than he had been the night before. A dark tunic with silver fastenings, a cloak bearing the Ravenspire emblem, a wolf in flight above a crescent. He looked exactly as he had in the corridor. Still, unhurried, and completely attentive. Those gray eyes found her with the same directness they had found her the night before, as though he had walked into this room already knowing she would be there. "You work in the kitchens," he said. It was not a question, but it wasn't condescending either. It was simply an observation from a man who observed things carefully. "Among other places," Ivy replied. She kept her voice even. She was good at even. He walked into the hall and stopped at a distance that was respectful, far enough to not crowd her, close enough to make conversation natural. He looked at the arranged cups, the laid table, the practical efficiency of everything she had prepared. "You organized all of this," he said. "The kitchens needed help." "That isn't what I said." He looked at her directly. "I said you organized it. There's a difference between helping and being the person who makes things work." Ivy looked at him for a moment. He was, she decided, a man who chose his words with the same care she chose her embroidery stitches, not for decoration, but because precision mattered. "You asked your brothers to find out who I am," she said. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not surprise, but perhaps a recalibration. "You heard that. I have good hearing." "So do I," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, quiet, careful, layered, that suggested he meant more than the literal truth of wolves and their senses. That he had been paying attention to her since before last night. That something in the way she moved through the world had already caught his notice, even from a distance. Ivy held his gaze steadily. "And what did your brothers tell you?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the same unhurried certainty he seemed to carry everywhere, like a cloak heavier and more real than the one on his shoulders. "That you are the Alpha King's wife," he said. "And that everyone in this castle treats you as though you are not." The outer hall was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, the castle was beginning to wake. Voices, footsteps, the creak of heavy doors. But here, in this moment, the silence held. "That," Ivy said carefully, "is a very accurate observation." Aldrich nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already decided to act on. He reached for one of the clay cups she had arranged, looked at it briefly, and set it back down. "I will be here for several days," he said. "The council matters will take time." He paused. "I expect we will speak again." He turned and walked out of the hall with the same quiet authority with which he had entered it. And Ivy stood among her arranged cups and her practical work, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that someone had looked at her and seen. Not the ward, not the convenient wife, not the useful, quiet woman, but something else entirely. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but she intended to find out. The council meeting was held that afternoon in the stone chamber, Ivy knew this because she was the one who prepared it, laid the fire, arranged the seating, brought the pitchers of water and the candles for the document table. She had been doing this for years, invisible and essential, and today was no different. She moved through the room with practiced efficiency while the council members filed in around her, speaking in low voices, not pausing their conversations to acknowledge her presence. She was used to that. What she was not used to was Draven entering the room and stopping when he saw her. It was brief, a fraction of a second. His pale blue eyes found her across the chamber and stayed, not with the distant cataloging attention of a man looking at a useful piece of furniture, but with something more unsettled than that. Something that told her he had, at some point between last night and this afternoon, become aware that he had made a miscalculation. Then Seraphine entered behind him, and his attention moved. Ivy finished arranging the last candle and left the room. She went to the Eastern Library, a long, low room on the second floor that few people used because the collection was old, and the texts were in 3 different languages, 2 of which most castle residents couldn't read. Ivy could read all 3. She had taught herself during the long winter seasons when Draven was away, and the evenings were endless, and she needed something to do with her mind that was larger than her circumstances. She pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, one of the old territorial records, bound in dark leather, and sat at the reading table near the window. Outside, the forest pressed close to the castle walls, the trees bare and gray in the winter light, their branches interlocked overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a second, older hall. Somewhere out there, a crow called once and went silent. She was 3 pages into the record, a dry account of border agreements made 2 centuries ago, when she heard the door. She didn't look up. People occasionally wandered into the library by accident, found nothing to interest them, and wandered back out. It happened enough that she had learned to simply wait, but the footsteps didn't hesitate at the door. They came in with purpose, and they stopped near the table where she sat. It was Soren, the fair-haired brother, the one who had noticed the uneven stitching on her hem. He dropped into the chair across from her, with the comfortable ease of a man who treated all furniture as his own personal property and expected the world to find this charming. "Old territorial records," he said, reading the spine of her book upside down. "Fascinating choice for an afternoon." "I find them useful," Ivy said without looking up. "Useful." He leaned back in the chair and folded his arms. "Most people find them unreadable. They're in Old Vordic." "I know. I can read Old Vordic." A pause. "Can you read the Ravenspire dialect as well?" Now she looked up. He was watching her with that expression she had noticed the night before. Amusement layered over something more genuinely curious underneath. "Why would that matter?" "Because the border agreements in that volume are only half the record. The other half, the Ravenspire counterpart, is in the Ravenspire archive. Most people don't know that. The 2 documents were split when the territories divided and were never formally reunited." He tilted his head. "Aldrich has the other half." Ivy looked at him steadily. "You're here because he sent you." Soren grinned. It was a very open grin, the kind that made it difficult to be suspicious of him even when you were trying. "He suggested I find out what you were doing." I believe his exact words were that a woman who leaves a banquet with that much composure and then shows up running the breakfast hall before dawn deserves to have someone pay proper attention to her. Ivy closed the book slowly. "And what does Aldrich of Ravenspire want with a castle ward who happens to be good at organizing cup arrangements?" "That," said a voice from the doorway, "is a question I'd prefer to answer myself." Aldrich entered the library with the same unhurried quality he carried everywhere. He glanced briefly at his brother, and Soren, with a complete absence of shame, stood up, bowed his head slightly to Ivy in a gesture that was surprisingly respectful for someone who had just been caught as a messenger, and left the room. Aldrich sat where Soren had been sitting. He looked at the closed book on the table between them. Then he looked at her. "How long have you been studying the territorial records?" he asked. 4 years, Ivy said, Since Draven left the first time, and I realized no one was going to explain to me what kind of territory I actually lived in. And what have you learned? She considered the question seriously, because he seemed to be asking it seriously. That Vorden's eastern border agreements were made under duress during the Reconstruction period, and have several provisions that were never properly ratified. That the Pack Council has more legal authority than Draven typically acknowledges. That there are 3 unresolved land claims in the Northern Territory that everyone has agreed by silence to simply ignore. She paused. And that whoever designed the water management system for the lower village did so without accounting for the spring runoff, which is why the lower quarters flood every year, and everyone pretends it is unexpected. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. You know more about this territory than most of the council members. The council members have other things to occupy their attention, Ivy said. I have evenings. He looked at her. That complete, steady attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he engaged with things he considered worth engaging with. Not performance. Not strategy. Just focus. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want to be clear that I'm telling you, because I think you have the right to know it, not because I have an agenda attached to it. Ivy folded her hands on the table. All right. The council sent for me 6 weeks ago. Not officially. There is no official record of the correspondence. But 3 of the senior council members made contact with Ravenspire through intermediaries because they were concerned about the direction of the pack. He paused. Draven's extended absence was not simply a choice about border patrol. He spent the majority of that season in a secondary settlement near the Ashfall Ridge. The woman you saw with him last night, Seraphine, has been part of his household in that settlement for the better part of a year. The library was very quiet. The crow outside called again, twice this time, and went silent again. I see, Ivy said. The council's concern is not primarily about the personal circumstances, Aldrich continued carefully. Their concern is about what comes next. Draven has returned, but he has brought a complication with him. Seraphine comes from the Grafen pack, a minor pack with significant debt, and a history of aligning with whichever territory offers the best terms. Her presence here is not simply personal. It is political. Ivy absorbed this. She was good at absorbing difficult information without letting it show on her face. It was one of the skills she had developed over 14 years of being the person in the room that no one thought was listening. He wants to dissolve the marriage record, she said. It was not a question. Aldrich did not look away. The council believes he intends to propose it at the formal session tomorrow. Tomorrow. Ivy looked at the closed book on the table. The old territorial records, with their dry language and their half-missing counterparts. 4 years of evenings. 3 weeks of embroidery stitches by candlelight. 7 words on a softened piece of paper. What happens to me, she asked, if the marriage record is dissolved? Under Vorden law, a dissolved ward wife with no bloodline claim to the pack retains the right to remain in the territory as a working resident, but loses all formal standing. He said it plainly, without softening. She appreciated that. In practice, it would mean you remain in this castle in precisely the capacity you currently occupy. Nothing would change visibly. Except everything, Ivy said quietly. Yes, Aldrich agreed. Except everything. She was silent for a moment. Then, why are you telling me this? He considered the question with the same care he seemed to give everything. Because when I walked into the breakfast hall this morning and saw how you had organized it, not just practically but strategically, as if you had thought about flow and efficiency and the comfort of people you owe nothing to, I thought that a woman with that quality of mind deserves to walk into tomorrow's council session knowing exactly what is happening around her. Knowledge doesn't change the outcome, Ivy said. Not always, Aldrich said, but sometimes it does. He stood, unhurried. There is one more thing. He reached inside his cloak and withdrew a folded document, smaller than a formal letter, sealed with the Ravenspire mark. He placed it on the table beside the territorial record. The other half of the border agreements you were reading. The Ravenspire counterpart. He glanced at the book. You might find the provisions in Section 4 of particular interest, specifically the clause regarding the formal standing of individuals connected to contested territorial alliances. Ivy looked at the document, then at him. I don't understand, she said. You will, he said simply. You're clearly very good at reading. And then, with a slight incline of his head, the same respectful gesture his brother had used, but carrying more weight somehow, he turned and walked out of the library. Ivy sat alone at the table for a long moment. Then she reached for the Ravenspire document, broke the seal, and began to read. It took her less than 20 minutes to find Section 4, and then she sat very still for a long time, because what she had found changed the shape of everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way the first crack in a dam changes things, quietly, irrevocably, with the patience of water that has always known where it was going. The clause was simple. Ancient language, precise meaning. Any individual formally recorded as a bonded alliance partner, which was the old territorial term for what Vorden called a ward wife, within a pack holding active border agreements with Ravenspire carried, under the original compact, a right of formal appeal to the Ravenspire High Council in the event of unilateral dissolution. Not a suggestion. A right, recorded 200 years ago. Never revoked, never even acknowledged, because no one had read both halves of the document in the same century. Until now. Ivy closed the document carefully. She placed it on top of the territorial record. She folded her hands on top of both and looked out the window at the gray winter forest. Tomorrow, Draven intended to dissolve the marriage record in front of the council. Tomorrow, Ivy intended to walk into that council session knowing exactly what she was. Not a ward. Not a convenient wife. Not the quiet woman who organized the cup arrangements and read old books in empty libraries. Something the law had always said she was, that everyone had simply forgotten to look at clearly enough. She had one evening to prepare. She was, it turned out, very good at evenings. She did not sleep that night either. But this time it was not grief keeping her awake. It was work. Petra sat across from her at the small writing desk, holding a candle close, while Ivy copied the relevant sections of both documents onto clean parchment in her careful, precise handwriting. The handwriting she had developed over years of recording castle inventory, drafting correspondence for council members who couldn't be bothered to write their own letters, and filling in the administrative gaps that a largely absent Alpha King left behind him like a trail of open doors. "You're certain about this?" Petra asked, for the third time. "I'm certain about what the documents say," Ivy replied, without looking up from the parchment. "I'm less certain about everything else." "That's honest. I've found honesty more useful than confidence lately." Petra was quiet for a moment, watching her write. The candle flame bent and straightened in a draft that came from somewhere in the old stone walls. This castle breathed, Ivy had always thought, in the particular way that very old buildings did, as though the stone itself remembered everything that had happened inside it and occasionally exhaled. "What does Aldrich get from this?" Petra asked. "He didn't give you that document out of kindness. Men like that don't make gestures out of kindness." Ivy finished copying a line and paused, considering. "I think he gets stability. If Draven dissolves the marriage record and installs Seraphine, a woman from the Grafen pack, as a formal alliance partner, the entire eastern border arrangement shifts. Ravenspire's agreements were made with Vorden under specific conditions. Grafen's debts and political history complicate those conditions significantly." She dipped the quill again. "Aldrich isn't helping me. He's correcting a problem. I happen to be the tool that corrects it most cleanly." Petra considered this. "Does that bother you?" Ivy thought about it honestly. "Less than you might expect," she said finally. "I've been someone's tool for 14 years. At least this time I understand the mechanism, and I'm choosing to be part of it. That's either very wise or very sad." Perhaps both. She finished the last section, set the quill down, and read through what she had written twice. It was accurate. The language was clear. The provision in Section 4 was unambiguous when presented alongside the corresponding Vordhen record. The two documents together formed a complete picture that neither one conveyed alone, which was precisely why no one had ever noticed it. She folded both copies of her transcription and placed them in the locked wooden box, alongside the iron ring and her father's letter, and, still at the bottom, Dreven's 7-word note. She looked at the box for a moment. Then she locked it and put it on the shelf above the writing desk. "Get some sleep," she told Petra. "I'll be fine." Petra looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she didn't believe Ivy, but also knew that arguing would accomplish nothing. Then she squeezed Ivy's hand once, briefly, and left. Ivy sat alone in the candlelight for a while. Outside, the forest was completely dark and completely silent, the way deep winter nights were. A silence so thorough it felt almost like a presence rather than an absence. She thought about her father's settlement, the small cluster of buildings at the edge of the border territory where she had spent the first 9 years of her life. She remembered the smell of it, wood smoke and pine resin and cold mud, and the particular quality of the light in the early morning when the frost was still on everything and the world looked like it had been made of glass overnight. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived at Castle Vorden, small and frightened and very quiet. She thought about the woman she had become through 14 years of being overlooked. Not smaller, as people tended to assume overlooked women became, but more precisely herself. More certain of what she thought and what she knew and what she could do, because no one had ever tried to shape her into something else. They had simply left her alone, and in the space of that neglect she had become, quietly and without announcement, someone quite different from what any of them had assumed. She blew out the candle and went to bed. She slept 4 hours, which was enough. The council session was called for mid-morning. Ivy dressed in her second-best dress, dark blue wool, simple and well-made, the kind of dress that said, "I belong in this room," without trying to say anything else. She braided her pale hair the way she always did, secured it with a plain cord, and put on her good boots. She took the transcription from the locked box and folded it into the inner pocket of her cloak. She went to the stone chamber early, as she always did, to make sure the fire was properly built and the water pitchers were full. The council members arrived in their usual order, the senior members first, the junior ones filtering in after, everyone finding their accustomed seats with the muscle memory of long routine. No one acknowledged her as she finished the fire and straightened. She did not leave. This was new. She stood beside the wall near the door, her hands folded in front of her, her expression the quiet war face that Petra had named years ago. Several council members glanced at her with mild confusion. She met each glance steadily and did not move. Draven entered last, with Seraphine a careful half-step behind him, close enough to signal presence, far enough to maintain the thin pretense of propriety. He saw Ivy immediately. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, but a cousin of it. The look of a man who had not anticipated a particular obstacle appearing in his path and was rapidly recalculating. Aldrich entered behind them both, with Soren and Kale flanking him. He took a position along the wall opposite Ivy, a guest's position, observational rather than participatory, but carrying more weight than any seat at the table simply by virtue of who occupied it. His gray eyes found Ivy briefly, checked something, her posture, her expression, the fact that she was still there, and moved on. The session opened with the standard territorial report, delivered by the senior council member, an old wolf named Edric, whose gray beard reached his chest and whose opinion of Draven's recent conduct was visible in every line of his face, without him saying a word about it directly. Then Draven spoke. He was controlled about it, which was the most painful part. He used the formal language of pack law, dissolution of the wardwife record on the grounds of territorial restructuring, a bloodless phrase that managed to erase 4 years in a hand-sewn dress in the time it took to say it. He spoke about the future of Vorden, about strategic alliances, about the need for a formal partnership that better reflected the Pact's current political position. He did not look at Ivy while he spoke. Edric cleared his throat when Draven finished. The Council notes the request. Under Vorden law, dissolution requires... A moment, Ivy said. The room went very quiet. Every head turned toward her. Draven looked at her for the first time, fully, directly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Seraphine's eyes were sharp and assessing. Edric looked, she thought, fractionally relieved. You are not seated at this council, one of the junior members said, with the automatic authority of a man who has never had to think carefully about a rule before invoking it. I'm not required to be seated to invoke a formal right of appeal, Ivy said. Her voice was steady. She had spent 14 years keeping her voice steady in difficult moments, and it served her now. Under the original border compact between Vorden and Ravenspire, the complete compact, both territorial halves, any wardwife formally recorded within a pack holding active Ravenspire agreements retains the right of appeal to the Ravenspire High Council in the event of unilateral dissolution. She reached into her cloak and withdrew the folded parchment. I have the relevant sections copied from both documents. The provision has never been revoked. The silence in the stone chamber was the kind that had texture, thick, pressurized. The silence of a room full of people whose understanding of a situation had just shifted beneath them, like ground after a tremor. Edric held out his hand for the parchment. Ivy crossed the room and gave it to him. He read it with the slowness of a man making sure he understood every word before he let himself react to it. Then he passed it to the council member on his left, who read it and passed it on. Draven said very quietly, "Where did you get this?" I read, Ivy said. I've had a great deal of time for it. Aldrich, from his position along the wall, said nothing. But Soren, standing beside him, had the expression of a man watching something very satisfying happen at a very close distance. The appeal provision, Edric said finally, setting the parchment down, is valid. The language is clear, and the document is authenticated by the Ravenspire seal. He looked at Draven with the expression of a man who had been waiting for an appropriate moment to say something for quite some time. The dissolution cannot proceed unilaterally. A formal review would be required, involving Ravenspire High Council participation. That review, Aldrich said from the wall, in the unhurried voice of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment, would take no less than 3 months under the compact terms, during which time all current alliance arrangements remain in their existing form. He paused. I would, of course, need to return to Ravenspire to convene the appropriate council. Vorden would need to send a formal representative. Another pause, not dramatic, simply precise. The most logical representative would be the individual who invoked the appeal. Every person in the room understood what he was saying. Draven understood it most clearly of all. His jaw was set, his pale eyes moving between Ivy and Aldrich, with the careful attention of a man counting the distance between 2 points and not liking the calculation. Seraphine's hand, Ivy noticed peripherally, had closed around the back of the nearest chair. This is maneuvering, Draven said. Not loudly, not with anger, with the flat acknowledgement of a man who had been outplayed and knew it. This is law, Ivy said quietly. The same law this pack has operated under for 200 years. I simply read it. The room was still. Edric looked at the parchment one more time. Then he looked at Ivy with something in his expression that she had never seen directed at her from a council member before. Not pity, not dismissal. Respect. The council, he said, will require time to deliberate on the procedural implications. He looked at Draven. The dissolution request is suspended pending review. He looked at Ivy. You will be notified of next steps. Ivy inclined her head. Thank you, Elder Edric. She turned and walked toward the door of the stone chamber. The room parted for her, not because anyone commanded it, but because something had shifted in the space, in the air, in the way every person in that room now understood who she was, relative to where she stood. At the door, she paused. She did not look at Draven. She looked briefly at Aldrich, those gray eyes already on her, steady and certain, and gave him the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, a thank you that was also something else, a recognition between two people who had both, in their own ways, been paying very careful attention. Then she walked out into the corridor, and for the first time in 4 years, the castle felt like somewhere she had chosen to be. The 3 months that followed were the strangest of Ivy's life. Not because they were painful, though some of them were, but because they were the first months she could remember in which she moved through the world as someone whose presence had weight. Not the weight of title or bloodline or political alliance, but the simpler and more durable weight of a person who had been seen clearly and had not looked away from what was seen. The formal appeal process required her to travel to Ravenspire. She had never left Vordhen territory before. In 14 years, her world had been the castle, the lower village, the forest edge, and the narrow roads between them. The journey to Ravenspire took 9 days by horse through territory that changed gradually from the bare winter forest of the eastern borderlands to the wide, pale valleys of the northern reaches, where the sky was a different color, deeper, somehow, as though there was more of it, and the rivers ran fast and dark between banks of gray stone. Petra could not come. The journey required formal status, and Petra held none. Their farewell in the castle courtyard on the morning of departure was brief and practical, because that was the only way either of them knew how to manage something that mattered. "Don't be sensible about everything," Petra said, adjusting the clasp of Ivy's traveling cloak with the focused attention she gave to things she cared about. "Sometimes being sensible is just being afraid with better vocabulary." "That is extremely wise," Ivy said, "and I refuse to confirm whether it applies to me." Petra laughed, short and real, and stepped back. Her dark eyes were steady and warm. "Come back different," she said. Ivy came back different. Ravenspire was not a castle in the way that Vorden was a castle. It was older, built into the side of a granite ridge as though the mountain had simply decided one day to become architecture. 7 towers, dark stone, narrow windows that caught the northern light and held it longer than should have been physically possible. The surrounding territory was wild and vast, and the wolves who lived there carried themselves with the particular ease of creatures who had never had reason to doubt their place in the world. The High Council was composed of 7 pack leaders, 1 from each of the unified territories. They were not, Ivy quickly understood, men and women who were easily impressed. They had seen every variety of political maneuvering across centuries of border disputes and alliance negotiations, and they looked at her across the long council table with the measured attention of people deciding whether she was worth their time. She gave them the same thing she had given the Vorden Council. Not performance, not deference. The clear, organized, well-documented truth of the situation, presented in language that demonstrated she understood the legal framework she was operating within, and respected the intelligence of the people she was speaking to. It took 4 sessions over 3 weeks. At the end of the 4th session, the eldest council member, a woman named Vasha, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who had said almost nothing during the first 3 sessions, and therefore made her words in the 4th carry enormous weight, looked at Ivy across the table and said simply, "You prepared this alone?" "Yes," Ivy said. "In how long?" "1 evening." Vasha looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Aldrich, who was seated at the head of the table in his capacity as High Lord, and said something in the Ravenspire dialect that Ivy was still learning. Aldrich's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. That slight recalibration she had seen once before, in the library at Vorden. Later, walking back through the long corridor that connected the council wing to the residential quarters, Aldrich fell into step beside her. "What did she say?" Ivy asked. Vasha. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding not whether to answer, but how. She said that Vorden has been wasting a significant resource for 4 years. Ivy absorbed this. She meant me. She meant you. They walked in silence for a few steps. The corridor was lit by iron sconces, the light warm and steady, casting long shadows on the stone floor. Outside the narrow windows, the northern sky was the particular deep blue of early evening in winter, and the first stars were becoming visible. The council will rule in your favor, Aldrich said. The provision is clear and the documentation is sound. Draven will not be able to proceed with the dissolution without formal Ravenspire consent, which will not be granted under the current circumstances. And Seraphine. Grafen Pack has already begun quiet negotiations with 2 other territories. They read the situation correctly. A pause. She will not stay at Vorden. Ivy nodded slowly. She had expected this, or something like it. The political architecture had been unstable from the beginning, built on convenience rather than genuine alliance, the kind of structure that looked solid until someone examined the foundations. What happens to Draven? She asked. Aldrich considered. He leads a pack that nearly fractured under his absence. His council is not forgiving. He will spend a considerable time rebuilding trust and demonstrating the kind of present, consistent leadership he has not shown in years. A pause. He is not a bad man, Ivy. He is a man who made choices that prioritized his own comfort over his obligations. Those are different things, but the consequences of both can be significant. Ivy thought about this honestly. She thought about the pale blue eyes that had looked at her across the great hall, and then looked away. She thought about 7 words on a softened piece of paper, and what she had wanted those words to mean, and what they had actually meant. She thought about the dress she had made, and the wildflowers she had embroidered by candlelight, and the particular quality of a hope that has been misdirected. I don't hate him, she said finally. I think I did for a while. But mostly I think I was in love with a version of him that only existed in what I wanted to see. The actual man was never really present long enough for me to know him. She paused. That's a different kind of grief than I expected. Quieter. Aldrich walked beside her without filling the silence, which she had come to understand was one of his particular qualities. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man who understood that some things said themselves more completely if given room. They had reached the end of the corridor. The residential wing branched left and right, his quarters in one direction, the guest rooms in the other. He stopped. She stopped. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want to be clear, as I was in the library at Vorden, that there is no agenda attached to the question. It is simply a question. All right, Ivy said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned, over 3 weeks in this vast northern territory, saw things very clearly, and reported them honestly. When the council ruling is formalized and you return to Vorden, what do you actually want? She had not been asked that question in 14 years. She stood with it for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. I want to be somewhere that my presence has meaning, she said. Not usefulness. I know how to be useful. I've done it my whole life. I mean meaning. I want to be somewhere that I chose, among people who chose me in return. I want... She paused, finding the precise word. I want to stop being a solution to other people's problems and start being a person with my own life. The corridor was very quiet. The stars outside the narrow window had multiplied while they talked, the sky fully dark now, the northern darkness that was deeper and more complete than anything she had known at Vorden. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then, Ravenspire's archive has significant gaps in its historical records, particularly in the border agreement documentation from the Reconstruction period. There is work there that requires someone who reads Old Vordic, understands territorial law, and is not intimidated by a council of 7 opinionated pack leaders. He paused. It is a real position, not a courtesy. It would require permanent relocation. Ivy looked at him carefully. You're offering me a position in the Ravenspire archive. Among other things, he said. And the way he said it, measured, honest, carrying more than the literal words, told her clearly that he meant it was a beginning, not a conclusion. That whatever he was offering was offered with full knowledge of what it might become, and full respect for her right to decide what she wanted it to be. She was 23 years old. She had spent 14 years being overlooked in a castle that had never chosen her. She had spent 4 years married to a man who had never seen her. She had spent 3 weeks in a northern territory where the sky was bigger and the air was colder, and everyone she had spoken to had looked at her and found her worth looking at. She thought about Petra's voice in the courtyard. Come back different. I would need to return to Vorden first, Ivy said. There are things I need to collect, people I need to speak to properly. She thought of Petra, of Edric, who had looked at her with respect in the stone chamber, of the Eastern Library where she had spent 4 years reading everything she could find. And I would need Petra to have a position as well if she wants one. She's better at people than I am. Your household staff would benefit from her. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression, not surprise, but warmth. Real warmth, uncomplicated and genuine. That can be arranged. Then, Ivy said, yes. He nodded once. The same nod he had given her in the breakfast hall at Vorden, when she had confirmed something he had already decided to act on. But different now. Fuller. A nod between equals who had taken the measure of each other honestly, and found the measurement satisfying. She returned to Vorden in early spring. The forest had changed in her absence, bare branches now carrying the first pale suggestions of green, the ground soft with snowmelt, the air carrying that particular smell of cold earth waking up. She rode through the castle gates in the gray morning light and found Petra waiting in the courtyard, with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral, which was how Petra looked when she was trying not to show that she was relieved. Ivy dismounted and they stood facing each other. Well, Petra said. Pack your things, Ivy said. We're moving to Ravenspire. Petra's carefully neutral expression collapsed into something much more genuine. She laughed, loud and real and completely unguarded, and Ivy, for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, laughed with her. The formal council ruling arrived 2 weeks later. The dissolution request was denied. The existing marriage record would remain in the pack ledger, but with a formal notation of separation by mutual territorial agreement, a legal distinction that preserved Ivy's formal standing without requiring either party to remain in the other's life. It was, Elder Edric told her privately, the cleanest resolution the law permitted. Draven came to speak with her the evening before she left. He found her in the Eastern Library, packing the last of the books she had borrowed over the years into a traveling case. She had asked Edric's permission to take copies of the most important texts, and Edric had told her they were more useful to someone who would read them than gathering dust on shelves where no one had. Draven stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of physical exhaustion, but the deeper kind. The tiredness of a man who has looked clearly at his own choices and found the accounting difficult. You're leaving, he said. Yes. He was quiet. Then, I didn't think you would. Ivy looked at him honestly. I know, she said. That was the problem. He absorbed this without defending against it, which was, she thought, perhaps the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. His pale blue eyes moved around the library. The empty shelves, the packed case, the window where the spring evening light was coming in at a low angle. You read all of these? Most of them twice. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who was arriving at an understanding that had been available to him for 4 years and had simply not been accessed. Too late to change what it meant, but perhaps not too late to understand it. I'm sorry, he said. Not with the performance of a man who wanted forgiveness, but with the quietness of a man who knew it was insufficient and said it anyway because it was true. Ivy looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I know, Again. And this time it carried something different. Not absolution. Not warmth. But the simple acknowledgement of a woman who had decided that carrying resentment into her new life was weight she didn't need. He left without another word. She and Petra rode out of Vorden the next morning with the early light on the forest and the whole northern road ahead of them. Aldrich met them at the Ravenspire border 3 days later, as he had said he would. No ceremony, no formal procession, just a man on horseback waiting at a crossroads in the morning mist with 2 of his brothers flanking him, and the easy posture of someone who is exactly where he intended to be. Soren, predictably, had opinions about how long the journey had taken. Cale, equally predictably, told him to be quiet. Aldrich said nothing. He simply looked at Ivy across the misty crossroads with those gray eyes, steady and certain, and the question in them was clear. Are you sure? She had read every document. She had learned a second dialect. She had stood in a council chamber and spoken the law clearly in a room full of people who had expected her to stay silent. She had said goodbye to the only home she had ever known and chosen, deliberately and with full understanding, a different one. She met his eyes and gave him the same small nod she had given him in the doorway of the stone chamber. Yes. They rode into Ravenspire together as the mist lifted and the northern sky opened above them, vast and deep and full of the particular quality of light that exists only in places where the world has been allowed to remain largely itself. Behind them, Petra was already talking to Cale about something that made him laugh despite himself. Ahead of them, the granite towers of Ravenspire rose against the morning. And Ivy, who had spent 14 years being the useful, quiet, overlooked woman in someone else's story, rode toward a life that was, at last, entirely her own.